seen her around because she has a seeing eye dog and very striking light blonde hair. You know, like a lot of blind people, she's blind. She's visibly blind because she's got no depth perception. The world is like a painting to her. If she doesn't have a seeing eye dog, she would run into every object.
Wait, is the person here?
Yeah. And as she tells me, first of all, seeing eye dogs are working dogs. Leave them alone. It's like a Jerry Seinfeld joke. She tells people she's blind, so she has a seeing eye dog, but not to touch the dog. They look at her, think she's blind, and start petting the dog. She says, "Stop!" And he's like, "What?" Because they think, "No, you can see it. I think it's a trick." No, she's visibly blind. She can tell when you're messing with her dog. That'll distract the dog, and next thing you know, the dog has forgotten his job. And she gets run over by a car. Leave seeing eye dogs alone. Don't touch them or talk to them or go, "Here, doggy, doggy." Okay, they are working. It's very serious. And she doesn't want to sign up for my class. You okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Did she just exercise?
Oh, I just ran here.
Okay. Okay. All right. And she's like, yeah, my students told me your class is like a half essay, half multiple choice. That's hard. I don't want to take it. And wait, so let me ask you a question. Raise your hand if, now you saw your test. Look at your test. The first number is the multiple choice. The second number is the essay. Okay? They're both worth the same, right? Raise your hand if you scored higher on the essay than the multiple choice. Now look around. Now raise your hand if you have a feeling that you did that for all three tests. There. What's harder, multiple choice or essay? Multiple choice is harder. Not only I already told you before, now I have evidence to prove it. Multiple choice tests are harder than essay. Much harder. It's just easier to fail. Okay. Okay. It's easier to fail. You show up, you take them, you bubble in A and B alternately and hand it in and get your F and move on. All right? But really, essay tests are better. All right? There's a reason for that. All right. Okay, that's the reason for why I give it. Although 100% essay test would be too stressful. And students would try to use that as an excuse to get on my back and complain that I'm subjectively giving you lower grades than somebody else. So there you go. That's why I'm doing it the way I am. It is the best system. All right. Now, hey, how about this? Raise your hand if it's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving and you're not going to be here. So you might even be higher. All right. So, so let's make it the week later, huh? I can't do the 25th because that's Thanksgiving. So 7 days later would be the 30th. Is that good? Like the math was on the 30th? You still will not have yet gotten my Civil War lecture during which I show you where all the battle sites are. Literally, I will be giving you that lecture after you finish the test on the 30th. We'll take the test on the 30th, and as soon as it's finished, I will begin showing you where all the locations are because it's part of my lecture. But there you go. The Civil War comes at the very end of the semester, and I can't have you take the quiz any later than that because I need to give you a full week to study for the fourth test. So you're going to have to find where all those battle sites are and things yourself from the book. It's there, but let's realize once again, do we teach geography and map reading in America anymore? No, we don't, because in the modern world of the 21st century, no other country but America matters, and we don't need to know geography, right? That's my deep sarcasm again. Here is one of the most critically important subjects. The world is becoming more and more important. America is not just the planet anymore, if it ever was, and yet we don't teach it anymore. Okay, we just don't teach it.
We just don't teach it.
And so if you don't have, map reading skills are a skill you learn.
Yeah, I took a geography class in high school, so I'm wondering when they stopped teaching.
Good for you. Were you in private school?
Yeah.
Okay, well, how many of you remember taking a geography class? Yeah, well, you took history classes too. And you didn't learn anything then. That's what I like about that, my show my daughter and my wife are all watching, the best show on Comedy Central. Have you seen it? Tower Prep. None of you have watched it yet? No, you should watch Tower Prep. You really like it. Especially if you've ever seen this 1960s show called The Prisoner. Patrick McEwen. 1960s. It is a remake of Prisoner set in high school. High school kids that are strapped on this high school somewhere, who knows where. And one of their instructors is Coach History.
What?
Coach History. It's a joke, yeah, because what do coaches always teach in high schools? They teach the history classes because they are not considered important. So just let the coach teach it. Okay, usually let the coach history teach APP history, where the students just get together and talk because the coach doesn't know anything. Oh well, so there you go. Alright, so that's
What channel is that on?
Comedy Central. No, I'm sorry, no, Cartoon Network. It's a live action drama on Cartoon Network, but there you go. It's a really good show, you should watch it. Of course, you missed the first few episodes. So, very, very good show. We were enjoying it.
Cartoon Network
Very
is
well
nowadays.
made indeed.
I miss Tsunami.
Yes. No one else has watched it. Well, there you go. All right. So now let's move along. I want to do a number of things now. I want to very quickly say just a few more things about white Southerners and then talk about black Southerners. Because certainly, if you can talk about America as just Americans today and include everyone, male, female, white, black, and all the other ethnicities and religions, and get away with it, I suppose you can, but you certainly couldn't do that back in the old days. White South and Black South are two very different cultures, peoples. Their interaction is limited and stilted. They are two separate cultures, and slavery is certainly the critical reason for that. So we can't and don't merge these together, and won't do that. Hey, I want to talk a little bit more about the test for a minute, if you don't mind, because I want to show you, I'm just being very, very nice to you. I know test 3 is hard. Let me point out that many of you didn't pick number 1 or number 2. You picked number 1.5. Okay, that people wrote half of number 1 and half of number 2. Okay, I also had a large number of people who didn't pick 2 or 3, they picked 2.5. Okay, where they were writing about this one, then they're writing about this one. I also had people who wrote 6.5, whereas they kind of started with President Jackson, skipped the other stuff, and then moved on to the answer of 1840. I went ahead and pretended that those were essay questions. Okay. I understand, it's difficult, and these are hard, and so if you ended up writing 1.5 or 2.5, I just pretended, okay, good, all right. Although instead of giving you a 25, maybe a couple of points, I'm not going to give somebody a 25 who wrote 1.5 or 2.5, okay. But certainly I did not count a whole bunch of points off. On the other hand, if you discussed the president, you only wrote about Thomas Jefferson, or only wrote about John Adams, I could not. I had to take points off at that one. Yes, sir?
What's this?
What's what? What was that shoved inside your test?
No. Someone passed this down.
Oh.
This is part of the test.
Oh, okay. Did you do that to him? Yeah. Okay, wow. Okay. Nothing, it's just another student messing with you, man. Okay, I was trying to think of what I'm supposed to say, but I can't remember what you say now instead of messing with you, man. Something similar. All right, there you go. All right. So there was my little discussion. And hopefully in test 4, it's not really possible. Here's what's going to happen. Many of you are going to write 3.5. You see how 3 and 4 are kind of linked to each other? And please don't pick 3.5 on purpose just to mess with me. Okay, but I'm already aware of that. Can you see how number 1 stands alone? Number 2 stands alone. If you're going to write number 2 about social stuff, I don't want to see any politics in that essay. That essay is about society and economy, chapter 13, okay? Whereas 3 and 4 are pretty similar, and obviously number 5 stands alone as well. No one is going to start writing about an election and then go into the battles, I hope. Okay, it's possible. All right, and once again, I'll try to be nice if somebody does that. Try to memorize a lot of stuff. I know how hard these classes can be. All right, I wanted to say a few things now about the yeoman farmers, the Pine Barrens people, and Southern white society before I even grab my lecture notes. It's true that 2 out of 3 Southern whites, Southern white families, Southern white males, did not own slaves. That's correct. And some of them might have opposed slavery for moral, ethical, or religious reasons. I mean, as the book might still point out, there were a few votes in the South on whether to ban slavery. A plebiscite. Remember that word plebiscite? When you vote on something, it's not candidates. Okay, and why? There was a plebiscite held back in slavery days in Virginia where 45% of the people of Virginia voted to ban slavery. Fortunately, that means 55% voted to keep it and it didn't get banned. So there were some people. But you need to realize that even most Southern whites who did not own slaves did grow cotton and needed to hire laborers to help them with the harvest. And there was no excess free labor around the South. There were no Southern white people who took jobs for wages like up north, because paying someone a wage for their work is what masters did with their slaves. Did you not know that slaves tended to get paid diddly squat for their work? You guys do know what I mean by diddly squat.
No.
Not that much, but they got paid. I mean, you understand you're a slave owner, that you want your slaves to work for you without having, you know what I'm trying to say, to smooth the wheel of commerce. You pay your slaves a little bit. They're still your property. You also tip them all the time. All right? And as a result, Southern white people felt that working for a wage was like being a slave. And no free white man would do that. Free white men in the South would not take the kind of good-paying jobs that in the North would put you in the upper middle class. A silver maker, or a goldsmith, or a gunsmith. All the kind of craftsmen and artisans. Up north, who was the silversmith who shouted out, "The British are coming, the British are coming"? Upper class? You get a feeling. He had to be upper class. In the South, he wouldn't even have that job. What was the only occupation a white male Southerner felt was respectable?
Farming.
Well, yeah. Farming. Being a farmer. You own your own land, you are your own boss, you do not have an employer. I mean, wage slaves, we all are. In today's 21st century world, if you do not own your own business, do you not have an employer? And if he tells you to jump, you better what? Ask how high. Or just jump as high as you possibly can. Now, you're not going to get beaten by an overseer, you're just going to get fired. And then your family will starve. Okay. There's a real big difference. As a result, when you needed, as a cotton farmer who owned no slaves, and your cotton is now ready to harvest, and you can't possibly harvest it yourself, because you don't have enough time before it'll spoil, you borrowed, you rented slaves from wealthy plantation owners. You rented slaves from wealthy plantation owners. That's another way that slave owners can make money. How do you make money with your slaves during the 360 days of the year? You don't need them to harvest cotton. Well, cotton's not all going to be ripe. It's not all going to become harvestable at the same time of the year. You rent them out to other people. You could also rent them out to businesses and factories. There were businesses and factories in the South. And the workers were almost all slaves because free white men would refuse to take a factory job no matter how well it paid, because that would make you a wage slave. Like some Yankee or some slave. Oh, I won't take such a job. That is below my dignity. Okay, as it were. Okay. And once again, as you might especially expect, if you have rented slaves for a plantation owner to work in your factory in Natchez or Atlanta, you got to pay them a wage. And those are very, very lucky slaves. At the very top of the social scale would be a slave who was lucky enough to be rented out to a city, given a factory job, paid a wage. You could walk the streets like a free man wearing a suit, a rented apartment. You can't quit your job. You're not free. But you're living a much better life than some unfortunate slave on a tobacco plantation in Virginia with an overseer and the beating and the horrific conditions. Okay. So we've just outlined, and we'll go back to the social scale for slaves. At the very bottom, you are a slave working in tobacco fields in Virginia. You have the worst possible occupation a slave could have. At the very top, for a slave would be an urban slave. And of course, above any slave at all would be a black person who was free. A free black. Would you not agree that the poorest free black in the South was happier than the best treated black slave? Okay. And so at the very pyramid would be a very small number of free blacks who had money. Why, there were even free black people in the South who had enough money to buy a plantation, buy slaves, and hire a white overseer to beat those slaves for you. Okay. While in Rome, do as the Romans do. Okay. They were living in a society in which wealthy people owned slaves. So the extremely small number of free blacks who became wealthy were a part of the same system. Okay. In the system you live in that system. Does anybody know the percentage, and it's a test question, what percentage of black people were already free in slavery days? In 1860, the date we have that. Because we have that statistics. You can go back, you can find that statistics. Anyone want to guess that?
Less than 10%.
Is an excellent guess. The answer is 6%. It's a wonderful number. Is 6% a very large number? Is it a very, very small number? No, it's just a small number. There you go. 1 in 19, as it were. Okay. I'm trying to think of myself, what ethnic group in America today is 5 or 6% of the population? Asian Americans? Because Hispanics and black people are both much larger than that. They're both twice that size. Jewish people used to be 5 or 6%, but they aren't anymore. Native Americans are only a couple percent. It's only like 1 or 2%. Maybe 2 or 3 if you count people who are only 1/4 or 1/8. But that's just 2 or 3%. Okay. All right. Good. All right, there. That was one of the things I wanted you to know about yeoman farmers. Now, Pine Barrens people, the hillbillies. These are the desperately poorest, the poorest of the poor, free white Southerners. And that's why I use that word free again. Because what would you rather be, a pampered slave or a hillbilly? I'd rather be a hillbilly because I'm a free man. And I could make something out of myself. Or maybe I could decide to do nothing but laze around and spend all summer long on my rickety porch with my feet up while other people farm, and come winter, I knock on the door of a wealthier farmer and beg food for my family. That's still a choice. A rotten choice, but a choice a free man makes. You know, the old story, the hard-working ant and the lazy grasshopper. You know, well, there you go. All right, so the poorest hillbilly was a very proud man, proud to be free. Okay, and that leads us to this last topic, Southern White Society and the Code of Honor. And if you don't mind, I'm going to have certain things to say about the Code of Honor that I might not be quite as aware of if I had been born in the South. But obviously, I was not born in the South, nor even though my accent would make you think I was born, say, in New Jersey or Philadelphia or New York and have just tried really hard to cover it up. That's just because I had a speech impediment when I was a child. And I had a therapist to help me get out of that. I was born in Glendale, California, which is a suburb outside of Los Angeles. But I've been here longer than anyone in this room has been alive except Charles. So I'm much more of a Texan than any of you. I've been here longer than you have on the earth. Been here since I've been living here more or less since 1976. Okay. I'll get to that in just a minute. Okay. So let's talk about Southern White Society because it's a paradox. Every time there's a good thing to say about it, there's a bad thing to go along with it. It's paradoxical. In the South, all white men could vote. But there was widespread property, all white men could vote, and there's widespread property ownership. Almost every free man owns land. His own man, you own your own land, then you are a person who cannot be pushed around. On the other hand, there was an unbelievably huge gap between the small number of incredibly wealthy plantation owners and the vast majority of average farmers. A huge gap between rich and poor. And democracies don't usually operate very well when there is a huge gap between the rich and poor. Of course, let's all point out that this is the year 2010, when there is or is not today an unbelievably huge gap between billionaires and the rest of us. This unbelievably huge gap between rich and poor. that is in the process of destroying our democracy as we live through it day by day. Okay, and at some point we'll end up with an oligarchic dictatorship if we don't already have one. Okay, you just cannot have one group of people. You got 100,000 people who are worth 100,000 times as much as most people, and you put those 100,000 people together in a group and they run everything. Okay, all right. But the South before slavery was much like that. By the time of the Civil War, public schools were already widespread across the North. The people paying property taxes to support schools are required to send their kids to them. Meanwhile, there's nothing like that in the South at all. Southern farmers, whether rich or poor, were indifferent to education, and illiteracy among white people was very, very high. All you got to be able to do is count your bales of cotton and be able to multiply to make sure the merchant isn't ripping you off, and any other level of education is just not. To this very day, true or false, many of the best universities in America are down here in the South. False. Almost all the best universities are up north or west coast. We all know that, don't we? And those states have something called state income tax. Not only do you pay a federal income tax to the government, but you pay a state income tax to the state to maintain good schools. What's the state income tax here in Texas? What's the rate? Zero. There isn't one. Because this is Texas, we ain't going to pay. If I don't have no kids in school, I ain't paying no tax to support somebody else's kids. Is the saying. Do you think Rick Perry's in favor of raising taxes so that he can improve our schools? I think he'd rather shut every last one down if he had to. Because rich people just send their kids to private school anyway, don't they? What do they care if there's public schools? It means nothing to them. Okay, so the South has never had a tradition of emphasizing education to this very day. And usually what money we do spend is for prestige. We do need a University of Texas just so we can say we do have a university. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about the Code of Honor. I got a sentence here. The inescapable presence of powerless slaves. Everywhere you look, black people with no rights, no power, no influence. You cannot not notice it. They are everywhere. South Carolina, they're 75% of the population. Georgia, they're over half the population. Okay. The inescapable presence of powerless slaves caused white people to react with extreme violence to even the most trivial slight or insult. Anything that might make you look like a slave, you absolutely did not accept that. Why? You have insulted my honor. We shall duel at dawn. Sir, slop. You've seen it. This is the stereotype of the overly inflated sense of being of white male Southerners. It comes from slavery days. Okay, if anyone even looks at you funny, you have to immediately, if you're poor, punch them in the face. If you're rich, fight a duel with them, because they're treating you like a slave. All right, so that's what happens in society when you have this inequality. Up north, people didn't feel that way, because up north, everyone was basically equal, or seen that way. Okay, it didn't have to act that way. This extraordinary sensitivity made violence extremely commonplace. This leads me to this discussion of why should you do the right thing? We all know what the right thing to do is in society. We know what people expect us to do. But there are two reasons why. There are two routes to morality. One is called the Code of Honor, and is very widespread down here in the South. And the other is what I'm going to call personal character. That's how I was raised, of course, by Yankee parents in California. Anyone here have the slightest idea about the Code of Honor and say you're growing up in Mexico and boy, the Code of Honor means everything in machoistic societies like Mexico. It means you do not want to be humiliated in public by being exposed your flaws. The Code of Honor means if other people find out what you have done wrong, you are shamed and humiliated. You have lost face in public. You are a destroyed human being. Okay? If you lose face in public, you're the Code of Honor. Your honor must be maintained. So, under the Code of Honor, if no one finds out what you've done wrong, is there a problem? There is no problem at all. How about if you cover it up and get the other people to agree that it didn't happen? Everything is still fine. So I'm not too impressed with the Code of Honor. In addition, the code of honor is this. What? You finished second place in the track meet. Second place is worse than last place. If my son doesn't get first place, I will not look at him again. You get the idea. Okay. That's also the code of honor, isn't it? That winning is all that matters. Personal character, it's inside you. You know when you've done wrong, and you should be experiencing Catholic-like guilt for it. Okay? Because you know you can't get away with it, only you always know. So I think personal character is a better way to run society than the code of honor, because personal character requires us to make our own judgments and not what other people tell us. Very good. A wealthy man's self-esteem was directly connected to their public reputation. Still is in most parts of the earth. And so duels, where poor people fight fist fights, rich people fight duels, very commonplace. No one would ever have recourse to law enforcement. That would be cowardly. If someone had acted violently to you or your family, you must act violently back to them and have a feud of some kind or something. But you can't call the police, which didn't even exist anymore. Law was for contract disputes concerning property rights or business contracts and agreements that lawyers could discuss. To this very day, almost all law cases are that way. 99% of all cases involving the American justice system have nothing to do with violence or crime at all. They're business law. If you ever become a lawyer, that's what almost all of you will be involved in. Almost none of you, if you become lawyers, will become prosecuting attorneys or defense attorneys. You'll be involved in representing businesses as they negotiate with other businesses concerning contract law and such like that. It's really boring and you make a lot of money. Okay, it's unbelievably boring, brain-crushingly boring, but you make a lot of money. Okay, being a prosecutor is a lot more interesting, and then you get government pay. Okay, yeah, and it stinks, but more interesting. All right. Now we can talk about slavery. I don't really have many transparencies about that. This is a transparency lesson. We'll use the date 1860, which is the last date before the Civil War, the last date when slavery was in full force. There were 4 million slaves in America in 1860, and 90% of them were at the bottom of even the social scale for slaves. They were just field hands. If you pick this essay, you better use the phrase field hand, or I will assume you don't know anything about what you're writing about. These are what these people were called, field hands. They worked in the fields. They're laborers, field hands. With women working alongside men, even when pregnant, basically you would be out there until the day you gave birth. You took a couple of hours off, then you strapped the baby to your back and back in the fields that very day. Okay? Because you're being treated like farm animals. All right. Very pampered farm animals, getting plenty of protein and carbohydrates and lots of liquid and lots of water, but still you're being treated like something that's owned by somebody else. And you'd be expected to start working in the fields at 12 years old or younger, and you would work in the fields until you were 60 years old or older, at which point you might be given a more cushy job inside the mansion, like a butler or a maid or something, if you lived that long. Lighter duties. Now, please realize that slaves worked very, very hard, but so did every farmer on earth back then. Were there any farmers anywhere on the planet who didn't have worked much harder than any of us will ever work in our entire lives? They all worked hard. So everybody worked hard. So, the lives of slaves were made intolerable, not by the hard work, but by the harsh discipline and brutality of the overseers. In fact, as the years went by, you need to realize that as the years went by, slavery always became worse and more entrenched. There were no efforts over time to soften slavery by giving slaves rights or responsibilities or opportunity to advance like the Romans did. Roman slavery, nothing like American slavery, nothing like it at all. Not race-based, and every slave in Roman times knew that if they just put in a few years of hard work for the master, they were always freed. Inevitably. I don't know if Roman slaves ever finished up their lives as slaves again. Yes?
I heard that after 7 years you're released, and if you wanted to be with your master, then you stayed with him.
In Rome?
In
ancient times?
Yeah.
Yes, that's just one of the many things, that's right. Because remember, and back in those days, everyone was what we would call today somebody's client. And so, once you got freed, you just became your master's client now, just like other free men. You might end up, if the master didn't like his son, inheriting the master's fortune. And my son's a jerk, and you've been working for me my whole life as your slave and not my client, I'm going to adopt you. And posthumous adoption happened all the time. Yes?
How would it compare to like serfdom or something like that?
Very simple, once again, similar to serfdom, but worse again because of the racial element. Okay? And the fact that people could be sold off the plantation and families could be forcibly split. The one thing that you never do to human beings, even in Stalin's dictatorship. He didn't purposely send a husband to one, well actually he did. Except in the worst imaginable dictatorships, you don't separate families. And in serfdom, you never did. One thing a serf had, you were born in a village, you lived your whole life in that village. Maybe you weren't even allowed to leave, but you weren't going to be sold to another nobleman, which could happen to you as a slave. And I think we mentioned that that was a very dishonorable thing for a master to do, that it could cause a master to lose face among his community if he ran his plantation so badly that he had to sell his slaves off. That would be a publicly failed plantation owner, like Thomas Jefferson. Okay, all right. And that states eventually, people found out that there were good masters and bad masters. Slaves knew and told each other which plantation owners were decent and treated their slaves fairly, and which were insane monsters. And other plantation slave owners did not like soft, friendly slave owners. They were giving them a bad reputation. And so laws were passed requiring all slave owners to buy overseers. And the overseers were told to pick out a slave and beat them every day, even if none of them have done anything wrong that day. State law. Okay. If one master is soft, all the other slaves will say, see, why don't you treat me like that nice master? So we'll just make them all beat them. This is an example of slavery getting worse over time, not better. Just like racism got worse over time and more entrenched, and people believed more deeply in it and thought they were right as time went by. In fact, the saddest thing I ever have to ask in a class like this is, here's a good question. From an historian's point of view, and I can give evidence to prove this, what decade in American history was the most racist decade? Not just against black people, but everyone. 1920s. Absolutely positively we can prove that prejudice against everyone was at its peak in the 1920s, when white male Protestants hated everyone. Black, Mexican, Chinese, Catholic, Jewish, what did it matter? They were all considered inferior. Yeah? Yeah. And so we had a very long way to go from then, and have moved very, very, very far in the last 90 years or so away from that. You would kind of wish it would be the 1850s, right? When slavery existed, not 60 or 70 years after slavery was over, but there you go. That's how difficult things are. Once something develops, it's very difficult to get rid of it. We all know that if you develop good habits, they stick with you your whole life. If you develop bad habits, they stick with you your whole life. Okay? And it's very difficult to break a habit once you've developed it. Very difficult.
Was that the law they had to hire overseers?
That's right. By the time we get to 1860, there were laws in almost every state in the South that you had to hire an overseer. You didn't have a choice. You had to. Okay. This is a perfect way to show that pressure from society is to make slavery more intolerable and harsh, not the other way around. Okay. And it's the racial element in that. I mean, in Roman days, in Roman days, slavery was an equal opportunity slavery. Anyone could become a slave for any reason and could be freed, equally so. All right. Matter of fact, Romans considered dark-skinned people to be significantly better looking than light-skinned people. To this very day. How much makeup does a white person have to wear on television so they won't look like a zombie? Pounds of makeup, or you will look like a dead person. Especially you, sir. You're a very pale man. And you can even see our varicose veins. Dark-skinned people have varicose veins too, you just can't see it because they have pigment. Pleasant pigment. Okay? All right. But there you go, which we lack. The Caucasians simply lack pigment. It's something we are lacking. Other human beings have what we do not have. Somewhere along the line, Caucasians lost their pigment, which has a very valuable use. It keeps you from receiving too many ultraviolet rays from the sun, for example. Okay, enough of that. Slaves, what they lack most of all is not the Bill of Rights. Do you think slaves were upset because they didn't have freedom of speech? You couldn't express the political opinions? Most of you don't even have political opinions. Okay? You're just living your life, and most people just live their lives. These people lack the most basic of freedoms, like the freedom to travel, to go where you wish. I may move to another state immediately. Can I not say, class dismissed, get in my car and drive away? If I feel like it, because it's a free country, go wherever I want. Slaves can't do that. They're caught off the plantation without a big metal tag saying what your name is and who owns you, and you could be shot on sight. Although that did not always happen because you then cost somebody $1,000. Okay, but you would certainly round them up, beat them some, and send them back.
Wouldn't that be like a legal dispute then, like a property dispute? Like
Yeah, you might be. You better believe, though, the person who owns that person has documentation proving that they do. It's a very valuable investment. Okay. All right. There we go. That's right. I already talked about that. Runaway slaves. Now, we're about to talk about it in a little while. We're almost never running away for freedom. Most of the time, running away slaves are people who are trying to reunite with their husband or their wife or their children or their parents who've been sold away. They just want to be together with their family. Okay? Because, as we're about to find out, you have to run an awful long way to get to freedom. And we're going to get to that by talking about the Underground Railroad for just a few moments, in just a little while. Okay, that's good enough, that's good enough. We talked about urban slaves, the 10% who were lucky enough to be rented to work in factories in the South, often being given jobs that would have been very high class in the North, like a bricklayer, or a wig maker, or a silversmith, or a gunsmith. You'd think a guy who knows how to make rifles in the 19th century would be respected. But in the South, it was the slaves who did that. White people only owned land. That's all they did is farm, or own a factory. They did not work. They were not laborers and would not take those jobs. Well, that's why there were a certain number of Irish immigrants showing up in cities like New Orleans to do the jobs that were too dangerous for slaves, like unloading the cotton off of the steamboats, because steamboats, there's lots of fire there. Cotton is extremely flammable. Any little spark and wham, all it goes up, so you certainly don't want slaves unloading that because they might be burned to death and they're extremely valuable, whereas nobody's going to give a damn about a bunch of Irish Catholics right off the boat. Many of them not even speaking English. Many of these Irish, they came off the boat speaking Gaelic. They haven't even learned English yet. And we're very, very bigoted again. But once again, reminding you that the most bigoted against Irishmen in America, getting beaten up every Tuesday by every Protestant he runs into, is a free man. Can make something out of himself. His children are free as well. Can make something out of themselves, and so are very, very happy not to be a slave. Okay. All right. Good. Even sawmills, iron workers, even the people who drove the barges and the wagons were all slaves. Let's see. Slave uprisings. There were some slaves. You would expect slaves to not want to be slaves and to be very angry at their masters and white people in general, and to look for any opportunity to rise up, except there aren't that many opportunities. Overall, please realize that white people outnumbered black people in the South then and today. To this very day, there are more white people in the South than black people. So 2 to 1 or so, 2 to 1. And these numbers are going to change now that Hispanics are a relatively important population number in all parts of the country. So these numbers are all changing, but I don't have them in my mind. A lot of this information that I've given you is actually 20 years old or so. It's changing, but there you go. Life always changes. You have very few weapons. Now, did you know that slaves, for example, wouldn't it cost a lot for masters to feed their slaves? So slaves had to feed themselves. Well, if you weren't working in the cotton fields, you had to grow, you were expected to. They had their little villages, like serfs. They'd have small little plots of vegetables. They would grow themselves. The master usually only provided you with some ground flour for your bread, and everything else you took care of yourself, including owning a pellet gun to shoot some squirrel or rabbits. Are you surprised that slaves own pellet guns? Think you're going to be able to launch an uprising with a pellet gun? No. Okay. They got real rifles. But once again, pointing out that many of you would probably be really cruel masters. You have an over-assumption over what it's like to actually have to interact with people even if you own them. That you still, you know what I'm trying to say there? Okay. One of the most, even if you escaped out west, Indians routinely rounded up runaway slaves and sold them back to white people every time. Why would an Indian sympathize with a person, an African person, not going to identify with them in the slightest? Okay, so you're really on your own. So very often these uprisings were really nothing more than an effort to get some revenge. Even though you knew it would almost certainly mean that you were going to die yourself, I guess you can take some whitey with you. Okay, as it were. The most famous of all these revolts is very useful for discussing, the Nat Turner Revolt. And obviously we can figure out the name of the black person who led this rebellion. Nat Turner, that's right. And it was in 1831 in Virginia. He was a free black. He's born free. He was born of free black parents. So he can get an education. Leaders are never ignorant peasants. An ignorant peasant cannot lead a movement. He doesn't have any knowledge. The first thing knowledge gives you is the wisdom to know when you're being exploited. You know, a slave with no education is probably going to think, my parents were slaves, I'm a slave, my children will be slaves. Yeah, I guess this is just the life for me. You give them a little education, next thing you know, they are very unhappy people. Yeah, the first thing education does, it makes you unhappy. Okay, so congratulations, you're all becoming unhappy adults right now. Okay. He was a fiery, self-taught preacher. As you might expect, by this time, black people have been in America for many centuries already. They have all converted to Christianity. And the preachers are not going to want white preachers, and white preachers wouldn't want to preach to them. They got black preachers. Do you think slaves became black preachers? Could a slave become a preacher? That's impossible, isn't it? A preacher needs a relatively advanced level of education, don't they? Okay, and so black preachers would have been free blacks. Okay, and once slavery was over and black people could vote, who do you think black people voted for if they were going to vote for a black person? A person who was free black and not a slave who was a preacher. They were the men who got elected to office. So the free blacks are the beginning of the upper class among African Americans. They would have already, come Freedom Days, owned land already, wouldn't they? They've had a huge leg up on the black people who had to start day one on when the Civil War came to an end as a free person with how much money in their pocket? Zero. Free blacks had some money already. They would have already had money and reputation. Okay, so that's the 6% who had all the advantages. And that's understandable. He would lead this rebellion of 50 lightly armed runaway slaves in attacks against white owners. 55 white people were killed. It's the biggest rebellion there was. And that wasn't all that impressive. And even then, strangely enough, every rebellion that ever occurred, it is recorded that the slaves differentiated between good slave owners who they left alone and bad slave owners. They attacked their plantations and killed them, those who had been mean to their slaves. You would think that they would not differentiate, but they did. And they were able to make that word that I can't think of. Okay. However, whenever these few and far between revolts did occur, it absolutely petrified the white people with a paranoid level of overwhelming terror. And as a result, the states would then pass more of these incredibly harsh laws. Why, we've had a rebellion. Let's require every slave owner in Virginia to hire an overseer and beat their slaves so there won't be another one. That's what caused. Let's make it almost impossible for a slave owner to free their slaves, even if they want to. as we get close to the Civil War, it became so difficult to free your slave, you literally had to first get, 24 fellow citizens to sign the petition granting the black person their freedom. Then the state legislature had to vote on it, each individual black person, and agree. So that by 1860, it had become almost impossible to free a slave. Whereas back in 1790, it was the easiest thing there was. You just wrote a document and said he's free, and he's free. So racism was making slavery more and more harsh and intolerable every year it existed, not better. Okay, I said you have to add all the money you can make off this horrible institution of slavery, plus the fact that it was entirely restricted to people of color, causing racism and slavery to join together and marry in a very unpleasant marriage and have some very unpleasant babies. Okay. And something, as a result, it would take 100 years for the United States to even begin to move away from that racism. And the Civil War ends 1865. Black people are granted the right to vote in the Constitution, so they only have to wait 90 years. It's another one of my dark, dark jokes. 90 years is an awful long time to have to wait for your rights. Yes?
Cotton became very profitable. Maybe that's the reason they clung to the blacks. Because
That's right. So the money is half the equation, racism is the other half, equals something very unpleasant. Yeah. If you take half of the equation away, you get more like Roman slavery, and it's not as bad. Or you get the racism that black people experienced, say, in the 1920s when they were already free, but it was pretty rough. I hope none of you guys, you realize how difficult it would have been to be a person of color, any ethnicity, with some dark pigment in the 1920s or 30s in America. Very, very difficult indeed. Okay, with lots and lots of prejudice in your face at all times. Okay. All right. You know, the overt racism that used to exist here in Texas, long before you were born. Not the subtle, covert racism that you may still notice once in a while here and there, which still exists. The residue. The residue is still there, but that's nothing like going back in a time machine, showing up in 1950 in Texas. That would be a real, unusual, you would not, very strange. The world has changed an awful lot in those 60 years, an awful lot indeed. Okay, even I can remember, only 47 years old, but I know that there was a lot more racism in America back then. Back then, if you were mixed race, no one liked you. No one. There was even a very unpleasant word for a mixed race person that you don't use much anymore. Hopefully, none of you know. Good, that's good. Charles, you remember what they used to call mixed race people? No, zebras. Zebras? Very unpleasant. See, it's very unpleasant. Remember the TV show Jefferson? The Jeffersons? One of their neighbors was a black lady who was married to a white guy. And that whole point of having them there was how much they had to deal with that, how every day of their lives was difficult. Okay. I think, thanks to the election of President Obama, I don't think there's any additional special prejudice against mixed-race people left in the United States. I don't think so. Any special additional prejudice if they find out you're mixed race. Now they don't like you. Okay. There was even another phrase for mixed-race people. It's a two-word phrase. I really don't want to use it. Oh, it's so old that the last time I saw it, because I saw it in a 1920s publication. High yellow. Have you ever heard that phrase either? Good. It's very old. It was very mean-spirited. Okay. All right. Okay. I've already talked about that. I talked about all of this stuff already. I talked about that. That's good enough. Good. Let's talk about abolitionists of the Underground Railroad. Very good. Okay. The Underground Railroad is probably the only thing about slavery you learned about in school, because you can cover that without hurting someone's feelings and getting fired. It's very dangerous as a history teacher in grade school or middle school or high school to cover slavery. You don't want to hurt anybody's feelings or be accused of being a racist yourself. And the best way to keep that from happening is not to cover the topic at all. Then you're not going to get in trouble. This is college, and you guys are all considered adults, so I have apparently, or supposed to have academic freedom. Bull crap. But there you go. You're going to get it now. Because as a result, we kind of overemphasize the significance of the Underground Railroad. And many of you may have this image of tens of thousands of black people escaping slavery because of good, decent people, white people who are helping out. No. It was extremely difficult and dangerous to get slaves out of the South with everyone watching. Really, maybe only hundreds of people escaped total. But that's not so. That took a great deal of effort to get hundreds of people out of the South. Maybe a few thousand. There was no documentation. It was a criminal activity the Underground Railroad was engaged in. They did not keep records, because then you could all get arrested. But there weren't as many as you might think. This map makes it look like thousands of people are escaping along each of these routes. I'll tell you that along each of these routes, maybe only a few dozen people ever escaped. Okay? And almost all the people in the South running the Underground Railroad are free blacks. Not surprising, if you think about it. Many of these free blacks might have relatives who are slaves, and that's who usually escaped. Who's the most famous of all the people associated with the Underground Railroad? Harriet Tubman is a free black woman living in Maryland who had many relatives who were slaves, and she used the fact that she's very close to Pennsylvania. Maryland is what, a one-day hike? There's no place in Maryland you can't get to Pennsylvania in 2 days walking. Huh? Maryland's a very narrow little state. Pennsylvania's right there. So if you happen to be a slave living in Northern Virginia or Maryland or Kentucky, and we're pretty close to the north, and all you had to do is spend a couple of days crossing to get to the Ohio River and cross the Ohio River without being captured, you could get away. But if you live down in Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia or Louisiana or East Texas, there's no way. There's too much distance to travel. You're never going to make it. Because I hope you realize that if I owned a slave in Alabama and if I went to a free state like Pennsylvania and brought my slaves with me, would they be free? They're still my property. If I own a car in Texas and have a Texas, look at that piece of paper that says it's my car.
The title.
Title. Can I take that car to New York State and it's still mine?
Yes.
Of course I can. Property's your property. Okay? If you are a runaway slave and you make it to Pittsburgh, you have to make it to Canada, which the map shows very well. Canada's not American territory. It's British territory. The British outlawed slavery, straight up. If you can make it to Canada, you can live in Canada in the cold as a free person. So you have to keep going. You're not free. You have a long way to go before you can make it to Canada, and that's an awful long walk from Mississippi to Canada.
Did slaves in Texas ever try to make it to Mexico?
What's down here? Yeah, okay. Do people from Mexico crossing these deserts die in the deserts today?
Yes.
All right, this is 1840. Okay, that's not a good idea. Okay, oh God, how far would you have to go to a settlement down here? And of course, to this very day, there's no prejudice against black people in Mexico, correct? Incorrect. There is significant and massive prejudice in Mexico against black people. Massive prejudice. And there are black people living in Mexico, and there always have been black people living in Mexico. There were black people living in Mexico when Mexico became a country. They're 5% of the population, and they experience severe prejudice. Okay. Because, as you all know, we are all responsible to tell authorities when we know someone who's stolen something, or he might be accused of being an accessory to the crime. Okay. And so, from the very beginning of our country's existence, there was something called the Fugitive Slave Law, that Americans were supposed to turn in slaves and expose the government anyone helping slaves run away. Now, obviously, that law would have been enforced 100% in the South. And once you got up north, people weren't so interested in enforcing that law. Americans have a long tradition of ignoring laws they don't like. And you were certainly not going to be brought to trial. But there you go. You were not doing something that was officially legal. Okay. All right. I suppose it was up north. Harboring a slave up north was like, I don't know, owning marijuana in California. Okay, it's more or less legal now. Okay, and now recently in Arizona. God knows, I could get I have so many ailments that I could easily get one of those damn pieces of paper signed by a doctor that says you can have some for medical reasons. Now, I can't remember what that word's called.
Prescription?
Prescription. Yeah, prescription. Prescription. Yeah. Okay, yeah. But that'll never, ever happen in Texas. I think Rick Perry would rather be electrocuted than legalize marijuana. Okay,
Texas
huh?
is actually a lot closer than a lot of the other states right now.
Maybe,
They've
I'd be quite
they've already
surprised.
introduced the bill into the House of Representatives.
We'll see what happens.
The Mexican voters
in the next
have
legislature. Yeah. I'm worried about the next legislature. I'm really worried that they're gonna introduce one of those Arizona-style anti-immigration, anti-illegal immigrant bills.
They already did.
Yeah, I know. I'm not looking forward to that. I just hope
HR
it's not passed. It's going to cause a mess. Texas has a different tradition. We've had Hispanics living in the state since this was Mexico. Okay, it's different than the other states.
I mean, they just introduced it like what
I don't think it's
earlier
gonna
this
pass.
week or something like that. Next week.
I don't think it's going to pass. I mean, I've been in California. Californians have more negative opinions about Hispanics than you'll find in Texas. I've known many liberal Texans, liberal Californians, who all of a sudden you talk about Mexicans, illegal aliens, and wow, do they turn on a dime. You know, all of a sudden they're expressing attitudes I didn't expect to hear from a liberal Democrat. Whereas I know many conservative Republicans here in Texas who realize that since they're employing almost entirely illegal immigrants in their own business, maybe they shouldn't send them all back to Mexico, in which case they wouldn't have anybody working for them. Okay. A purely Republican reason, a conservative, economic-oriented reason why you don't round them all up and send them back. Okay, because you are employing them. Okay. All right. How many landscapers in this city could survive if they weren't hiring Mexican labor? Native-born Americans, whether they're white or Hispanic, won't take those jobs. They're too low paid. It's too hard work. Not the low pay. Take that back. It's too hard work. Out of 100-degree sun.
The productive jobs, yeah, the ones that are the actual production of goods.
Hispanics are now becoming a very large percentage of our factory workers in this country. Because Americans born in this country don't want to work in factories anymore, even if they're getting $20 or $30 an hour. Chopping off the legs of a chicken all day long. Cha-chunk, 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 cha-chunk. People used to, 100 years ago, people would die for a good paying job in a chicken plant, wouldn't they? But nowadays we want office jobs, don't we? We don't want to work in a factory chopping off chickens, even if it is good pay, and it is good pay. You get good pay working in a chicken plant. You come home every day of your life, you never get the chicken smell off.
Yeah, but you're going to smell like that anyway.
You're going to smell like that animal your whole life, yeah. Well, the same thing will happen if you work at church's chicken. Anybody ever worked at a fast food chicken restaurant? I have worked at a chicken fast food. You get the smell of chicken fat is on you your whole life. You cannot shower it off. Your clothes smell like chicken fat. Your shoes really end up smelling like chicken fat. You have to wash off the chicken fat from the floor at the end of the night because it gets everywhere.
I burned the clothes after I quit there.
You did? Yeah. Luckily, they just fired me. I was fired from all the fast food places I worked at. I was a bad worker. You know, the kind of person who would only work when I was being watched, and as soon as the manager turned his back, I just stopped like a robot who ran out of energy. The worst worker imaginable. Yes. Okay, good enough. Moving along. Good. All right. Now, let's do a little bit of biography, because usually I don't cover biography. Now, some of you may have had a few history teachers who were good teachers. And what they probably did is reinvent history by turning into a bunch of biographies, because we can relate to human beings. Something I almost never do, which makes it very unusual why I'm a good teacher myself. But in this case, if I want to talk about slavery, I should really talk about Frederick Douglass, because he experiences it all. Frederick Douglass, what happened, he's like, you should make a movie about him. He experiences everything a black person could experience in the 19th century. From bad to good. And he goes through the entire spectrum. So by following his life, we can see all the different things, the good and the bad, that could happen to black people back in those days. Because when he was born before the Civil War, many, many decades before the Civil War, and lived into his adult years before the Civil War occurred. He doesn't die of old age till the 1890s. So he also lived for many decades after the Civil War was over and slavery was over. So he straddles the entire 19th century. Does Frederick Douglass, born in 1818, died in 1895. He's mixed race, as many black people were then, and many black people are today. Black people brought to America as slaves have been here for 300 or 400 years. That's an awful long time not to have sex. Human beings have sex, and when people have sex, babies are born. Okay. And so, large numbers of African Americans this very day are mixed race, just like Frederick Douglass is mixed race, and President Obama is mixed race. And born in Maryland, that's important, because that means he has a chance to make it if he can meet the right people, he could get out of slavery. Because Maryland doesn't have that many slaves in the first place. It is very close to the north. All right? And as a result, Frederick Douglass is going to, early in his life, come into contact with white abolitionists, who in this case we could also call philanthropists. Isn't that a big word? Philanthropist? Can a poor person be a philanthropist?
No.
Why not?
You have to have money.
You have to have the resources to be able to help people. A philanthropist is a rich person who helps other people who aren't rich. That's it, really. It is. Because you have to have resources. You can't be a philanthropist, even if you want to. You can be a mentor, but you can't be a philanthropist. You're a humanitarian. Yes, you can be a humanitarian, not a philanthropist. You have to have resources to do that. Okay? You really do. Frederick Douglass's master decided that he was going to use Frederick Douglass as a house slave. And house slaves were raised very differently. They would be playmates for the white kids. And would be told things like, all right, now the white kids are going to be with their tutor. You, Frederick, turn around. Don't listen. Of course, he turned around and did what? Listen. That's right. You learn how to read and write by facing the other way. It's like my favorite story about the Marx Brothers. They couldn't afford to give all the boys piano lessons, so they gave Chico piano lessons and told Harpo to listen from behind the door. So Harpo was a pretty good piano player, but Chico was a spectacular piano player. Well, there you go. And so he's being raised very differently. Then, when he's about 10 or 12 years old, his master falls on hard times and has to lease Frederick Douglass out to a plantation to work as a field hand, where it is obvious that a guy like that, who hasn't had the background, is going to get beaten to death by an overseer. But luckily, the news reaches a group of white abolitionist philanthropists from Pennsylvania. And since Frederick Douglass is just being leased, the philanthropists are able to buy Frederick Douglass from his owner, who was in financial trouble, bring Frederick Douglass to the north, and grant him his freedom. So now he's about college age and he's free. And the philanthropists wanted to do this because there was something else about Frederick Douglass. Everyone knew he was incredibly intelligent. And because racism was now being reinforced by science, there was a belief among white people that all black people were mentally inferior to white people, genetically so. And if that is true, then they must all be inferior. So now the abolitionists have an opportunity to prove this to be bunk. Now, back in those days, you weren't going to be able to get a black guy into college anywhere in America. So at considerable expense, they sent him to get his college education in Europe. Matter of fact, he became the first black man in America with a PhD. He's brilliant and extremely well-spoken with a spectacular vocabulary. He would have been more intelligent than 99% of all the white men in America, or 99.9%, as you might expect. And so he has a great opportunity here. Already before the Civil War, he became an editor of an abolitionist newspaper and went around the country, went around the north, giving speeches to white audiences. The map's not up there. Out in the countryside. These are free states where many white people had probably never met a black person in their entire lives. And if you have never even met someone from an ethnic group, you can more easily have stereotyped feelings about people you've never even met. It's much easier. And once you have met someone, interacted with them, it's got to soften your feelings. You now begin to see these people as human beings. But more than that, Frederick Douglass is going to prove in these speeches how much more intelligent he is than everybody else in that room. And as a result, that's really going to have to seriously damage their racist feelings, force them to moderate them, and begin to see black people as human beings, as smart, as potentially as intelligent as anyone else. Very important. When the Civil War breaks out, as we're going to find out, Abraham Lincoln did not immediately want to free the slaves. He had to be convinced, and Frederick Douglass was one of the men who convinced him, having many, many meetings with the president. And after the Civil War is over, he also does interesting things in his life that I don't have time to talk about. But he's a very interesting man as a result, an excellent topic for a biography. He has not been overcovered. Not like Abraham Lincoln. Every single graduate student in America has not written an article about him. There's still things to learn about him. It's an interesting topic, person to pick. Whereas I promise you that every single topic imaginable, someone's already done a research paper on Abraham Lincoln on it. There's no room for any more papers on Abraham Lincoln. He's done. Okay? But there are plenty of other people to write about. Okay, there. That's the end of chapter 13. And we now, as I promised you, will begin the lectures for chapter 14 right now. And see how far I can get into the material for chapter 14. Okay, no, I don't need that yet. All right, and I know what I want to cover. I want to cover Election 1848, Popular Sovereignty, Zachary Taylor, and see if I can get to these two terms. We'll see. We'll see. So now with chapter 14, we leave social history. We go back to Washington, D.C., and we're going to cover the 12-year period from 1848 to 1860, in which interestingly enough, just like the 12-year period from 1763 to 1775, when in 1763 most people thought America would always stay British. By 1775 we opened fire on the British Army. In 1848 most people would have thought that America was somehow going to survive these sectional crisis over slavery. By 1860 most people were just hoping for war. They were that angry. The North and South, over 12 years of disagreements, became so angry with each other, they just wanted to gun each other down. We'll deal with this disagreement on the battlefield by 1860. Okay. Sectionalism, that's what the book calls chapter 14, doesn't it? Who's got the book in front of it? What is the title of chapter 14? The Coming of the Civil War. What's the subtitle? What's the question underneath it?
What caused the division?
The division, the sectionalism. But the fact that year after year, America became more and more two countries, the North and the South, united by the single fact that every 4 years we join together to elect a president with nothing else in common whatsoever. That some Democrats were from the North and some Democrats were from the South. And some Whigs were from the North, and some Whigs were from the South. Except for that, in every way imaginable, culturally, economically, and politically, the North and South didn't even like each other and weren't even interacting with each other anymore. Okay, there. That was the introduction to chapter 14. Now let's go directly to the election of 1848. From the election of 1848, 52, 56, and 1860. All four of those elections were elections in which a single issue dominated national politics in the presidential elections. And that issue had to do with slavery, but that's what you would tell middle schoolers, your college schoolers, so you're going to get a more complicated version of that. That the question was whether slavery should be extended into the Western territories. Should there be an extension of slavery into new parts of America, and how much and where? That is what everyone was arguing over, not whether slavery should be legal or not. It was obvious to everyone, even the most religiously and morally motivated abolitionist in New England, who hated slavery with every fiber in his body, that the American Congress voted to ban slavery everywhere, the South would secede from the Union, a war would commence, and perhaps hundreds of thousands of men would die years before they needed to in brutal battles. And nobody really wants a country to tear itself apart like that if you could avoid it. Okay, even for something as morally viable as banning slavery, really did 600,000 people have to die for that? That's kind of sad. Okay, and so no one ever talked about banning slavery. It was legal in the South. It was the basis of their entire society. There was no turning back. Those states that are already colored peach on this map were going to stay slave territories. And those states colored purple were free states, and they were never going to let slavery become legal. But there were still lots of additional territories, like Nebraska, Kansas, Utah, and New Mexico territory that weren't states yet. And as they were settled, they'd have to make that decision. Should we allow more slave states or not? The northern states didn't want there to be any more slave territory. The southern states felt that was insulting their honor and dignity. And you know what happens when southerners feel that their honor has been insulted, their dignity is broken? It's time for fighting. So that's the basis. The question is, the actual question is too difficult for people to face. You know, it's too difficult for people to face the question of whether slavery should be outright banned or not. So we supplemented it down to, well, let's talk about and argue over whether slavery should be extended out west. Okay, it's like discussing abortion is too disturbing for people. So let's just talk about whether we should allow late-term abortions or not. You know, the Republican point of view, that's much stronger. Okay, you can't convince me that a woman should be allowed to have an abortion when they're 8 or 9 months pregnant. If a baby could be born safely and be living, then that should be the stopping point. Just like you can't convince me that 16 little bubbles, 5 minutes after a woman becomes pregnant is a baby. That is not a baby, that is 16 cells becoming 32 cells in a tiny little petri dish. Okay, but in between, there's no more agreement. No one will ever agree upon what point a fetus becomes a baby. That will never be scientifically agreed on by people. That's subjective, isn't it? Very subjective. Matter of fact, the entire issue is subjective. Okay. Okay. In the election of 1848, the Democrats ran a person who's not very important. You don't really need to know that the man who lost the election of 1848 is Lewis Cass, C-A-S-S. What is important about Lewis Cass is a position he developed concerning how to deal with the question of the extension of slavery to western territories like Kansas. I'm going to use Kansas as an example because people in the 1850s are moving to Kansas. Kansas is going to be our next state. Okay? And we'll get to that in a little while. And the position that he came up with was called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. You see, what Cass said is, if our Congress has to vote, free or slave, every time a new state has enough people to become a state, then every couple of years we are going to have a massive crisis on our hands. And every couple of years the Congress is going to beat each other up to pieces over this issue. It'll tear the country apart. But there is something that all Americans believe in, and it's called democracy. So Lewis Cass came up with the idea of letting democracy solve the problem of extension of slavery out west. Let's just let these people decide for themselves. Sovereignty means you have control over your own lives. So the idea would be that when a territory had enough people to be entered as a state, the voters would decide that very day. They would have a plebiscite. And the voters would get to decide whether they wanted to be a free or a slave state themselves. And that idea became a popular idea. Although Lewis Cass was not elected. Because moderate compromises, you would think, if this people wants this, and this group wants that, and I craft a compromise where you get half of what you want, and the other guy gets half of what he wants, isn't everyone happy? No, everyone's pissed. They didn't get all of what they wanted, they didn't get all of what they wanted, everyone hates you for the idea you came up with. There was a commission set up by President Obama that just announced that if we don't want our national debt to destroy our nation, we must significantly raise taxes and cut spending at the same time. I promise you that the Republicans will not let rich people get taxed. The Democrats will not let budgets get cut on poor people. We are not going to implement any of that. We're just going to keep taxes low, raise spending, and destroy our future. That is guaranteed. Okay. So popular sovereignty didn't make anybody happy. Southerners said, hell no, we want all of America should be open to slavery. Slavery is a good thing. And the Northerners say, no, 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 we don't want any more slave states anywhere. So popular sovereignty was an idea that wasn't very popular with everyone. Although, no, I have one more thing before we let you go. As I said, I need to get this term done and I will let you go. We don't have time for this one. So now let's get Zachary Taylor elected president and find out who he is and then let you go. He's a Whig. This is the second time the Whigs have a chance to get their candidate elected. And once again, they have picked an old general. Zachary Taylor, the victor of the war with Mexico. He's a hero. He gets elected by the American people. And he adopts popular sovereignty as his idea as well. So he's in favor of it. Then, unfortunately, he'll die after only 2 years of office by eating a bowl of bad cherries and milk. For a long period of time, we thought that that was because he ate bad cherries. Modern scientists have determined that you cannot die from eating rotten fruit. You can die from eating bad milk. Sour milk will kill you. Okay, and that's what killed the president, sour milk. Okay, there you go. A good place to stop, I guess. When we come back, then we have 4 classes left. 1 class, 2 class, 3rd class, 4th class. That's what I got to do. I got to make it to about here by the end of Thursday. Then after Thanksgiving, then I'll have 1 last week to finish the Civil War in 2 lectures. Guys, that's what we're doing. We're good. Good. Let's pass them out. So, here, can you find this? There, good, grab it. And it's going to change you as not being present. Last name? Well, count you as present.
I'm not that pale, am I?
Sure. I what did it say in the syllabus?
Really,
I need to
that
put that in very soon. The syllabus says that I need to put the extra credit